Alrighty guys, welcome back to beer school. Once again, it's Sunday. It's another Sunday cooped up inside and can't come out. You can't come to our beer school, so beer school's coming to you. If you guys have any requests of topics you want us to address during beer school, we're all ears. We'll listen to you guys. We'll try to address whatever styles, whatever questions you have and create a little class out of it. And today's class is going to piggyback on customer requests of sour ales. When most people think about sour ales nowadays, they think about the Goses, the Berliner Weiss, or some of the other kettle soured beers that are really popular. And those will gain popularity as we creep through the warmer winters of spring and then summer. But I decided to do a little bit more of a historic take on the different types of sour ales. There's really 6 or 7 key groupings of sour beers that are out there on the market right now. So we'll kind of go through it a little bit. We'll start out with the history of sour ales. Sour ales history really does also piggyback on the history of beer in general. Before the microscope came along, beer was being made 600, 700, 800 years ago. There's a time whenever society decided to separate grain from grape and other fruits and other sweeteners. And that's when beer was born. As beer or ale kind of came into being, we were really at the mercy of what lived in our area. Terroir has been just as important of an influence of beer flavors as it is in wine flavors, even though we can control the flavors much more deliberately now through designer yeast and designer ingredients. That's not always been the case. Historically, if you lived in an area where you could make a beer, you basically brew with these grains and you let the unfermented beer sit out. Whatever microorganisms were in the air would kind of float along and land into that unfermented beer as it cooled. And at some point, it would kickstart the fermentation process. If you lived in areas like England or some colonial American times, not going back quite as historic, or other places, particularly in Europe, you did have a lot of brewer's yeast or yeast combinations that we now dub as brewer's yeast that gives us very pleasant flavors in beer. And so then you can make like ales, you can make IPAs, you can make rudimentary brown ales, mild ales, strong ales, whatever you wanted to make. But if you lived in areas like Brussels, Belgium, and in northern Belgium, those brewer's yeast were not the most prominent microorganisms in the air. It was a collection of bacteria. And sometimes whenever you hear the term bacteria, your natural reaction is go, ooh, I don't want bacteria. But the truth is, yes, you do. You want bacteria in some of your beers because that's what makes them sour. Think of it this way. Ales done by brewer's yeast, whenever they ferment, they have a tendency to produce a large amount of alcohol per yield and not very much acidity. Bacteria almost does the opposite. If the bacteria of the beer is going to be the main culprit fermentation properties, then you end up with a lot of acidity and maybe not as much alcohol. But that acidity that's generated instead of alcohol is what creates those very sour flavors that we're used to in sour ales. It's responsible for those crisp, tart, refreshing flavors that might remind you of gooseberries, might remind you of white wine, very sharp ciders, lemon, lime combinations, and all those things. And if you're in Brussels, the main brewery, the historic breweries would make beers called lambics. And what a lambic is a beer that's left out to ferment with whatever elements are in the air. When it falls into the fermentation vessel, it's going to create a whole host of other kind of flavors. These very sharp, sour flavors that are almost too unruly to drink. So what they do is they let them ferment for a very long time. And when you're looking at organisms with names like Pediococcus, Acetobacter, Lactobacillus, and then the wild yeast that you have, Brettanomyces groups, those combinations sometimes will take a very long time to fully ferment and become a really nice flavor, sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Those are unblended lambics. They would not be carbonated, they'd be very leathery, very mature, a lot of earthy notes coming from, and the sourness would be very refined sourness. With that kind of time it took to ferment, you can expect these beers to be quite expensive. Over time, they realized, okay, let's start doing some blending with some of these beers. Let's blend a beer that's still in the process of fermenting, maybe it's only a year old, and blend it with beers that are a little bit more fully fermented, and we'll go ahead and bottle the beer at that time. What happens is the 1-year-old portion of the beer is still fermenting inside that bottle, and even though it's been closed up. So what you end up with is more carbonation that's being built along with some acids, along with some alcohol. So the carbonation builds up inside the bottle. It only comes out whenever you pop the cork, whenever you pop the cap. What that happens is almost this geyser effect. And that geyser effect, they would look at that as it kind of exploded like a geyser, erupted like that way. So there become this corruption in terms that goes from geyser to goose. And so some of these beers now we call goose beers. So if you ever taste a lambic and you say it's too flat, it's because you're used to goose beers, not lambic beers, even though they're very, very similar. So the example we have today is a Lindemann's Cuvée Rene. Lindemann's kind of gets a bad rap for making overly sweet sour beers, fruits beers. The Creeks, their Framboise, the Pêche. They have a few other kind of beers, cassis, that go heavy on the sweet side. But the base beer is their base goose. And this is a special blend of their goose, and the brewmaster puts his name on there, Rene. So this is the Cuvée Rene, and it's a very good example of the Belgian goose without breaking the piggy bank. This is actually a very affordable beer. It's $7 for a bottle. If you go north of Brussels into the more Flemish regions of Belgium, you end up with a slightly different kind of sour ale. You end up with the Flanders Reds and the Eau de Bruins. Similar to the beers of Brussels, the Flanders Reds uses cherries. They have this whole host of cherry fields, the Sharpies cherries that are lined in the northern parts of Belgium. So they let those cherries kind of weather on the branch before they pick them. That intensifies their flavor. They use those and put them in the beer. And they also do the blending thing like the goose did. They'd use some darker grains for color correction and also to kickstart the acidity a touch. So those beers have this really distinctive characteristic. They age them on oak, so when you take the elements of all that extra oak aging that they do, the unique blends that they do, the cherries, and then the uniqueness of their microflora in the northern Brussels, north of Brussels, Flanders regions, ends up being a little bit more of the Acidibacter bacteria. A lot of schools of thought say that they should not be heavy on the Acidibacter, but that's the only way I think you get those sharper balsamic notes when the Acidibacter and the Lactobacillus work in tandem. When they start to ferment those cherry sugars, what they end up creating is this very rich red wine component, and so you can get some strong Bordeaux wine or your more fortified red wine flavors coming from that. Hints of maybe sherry, hints of Madeira, some chocolate notes can come through with those dark grains. So you end up with the very complex flavors that just hinge on that balsamic characteristic in a very pleasant, very robust, but very savory way. So here we have the Monk's Cafe by Steenberg. They make a really nice version of that. They throw it in the cans, $4 for this guy. It's a pretty good deal as well. Counterpart to that, if these few sour ales that we talked about first of all are too acidic for you, not all beers are that highly acidic. You end up with the Petrus Eau de Brune is another kind of brown ale of the Flemish regions. This beer is not quite as sour. They stop the fermentation a little bit short, and they're going to age these largely in stainless steel kettles, and you evade the oak aging. But with that darker grain that we're going to use in here a little bit more, and that kind of backseat on the acids, it creates this toasty, almost chocolate, refined kind of flavor with some of this earth notes. There's a gaminess that sometimes comes from the better examples of the Eau de Bruins. Reminds me sometimes of just sod or moss or some sort of gaminess of mushroom. So I like the characteristic of some of those. So you got to like for a little bit more complex of a flavor without all this sourness. Fast forward several hundred years. At some point, these first few beers kind of lost favor quite a while. And if you jump ship, go get out of Belgium a little bit and start going to Germany, they also had some sour ales in the northern Germany regions of the Goslar region and in Berlin that largely went extinct for a good portion of time. There may not have been any of these breweries making the Goses and Berliner Weiss beers at one time, but they made a big comeback, largely on the backs of Anderson Valley Brewing Company, which was sold and then bought about 8 years ago. When that happened, Anderson Valley was a kind of a crossroads brewery. They were losing traction because they were not making the beers that the new beer drinkers wanted to drink, but they were afraid to change too much about those flagship beers that started them 20 years earlier in fear that they would lose that customer base. But whenever the brewery was sold, one of the first things that the new owners came up with is they reinvented the sour ale. They recognized pretty quickly that the Belgian beers, even though they're very tasty, that earthy component comes along with them may be a little bit challenging for the beer drinker, that they needed a more simplistic sourness. And they knew historically some of the beers like the Berliner Weiss and the Goses kind of got you there. They needed to come up with a way they could make an everyday sour beer without being too pricey. So they come up with their version of sour ales. The Kimi, the Yink, and the Holy Gose was the first one. Decent success on that one. But once they started adding fruit flavors to their Goses, when it really started kicking off. Now, the Gose flavor really took on the mineral characteristic of the Goslar River, and they call those mineral salts. And that mineral salts term eventually was translated very literally to sodium dioxide, sodium to salt. So whenever they add saltiness to the beer, it adds this kind of brininess, which was not classic in the original ones. But these beers are traditionally sour wheat beers. Lactobacillus is the culprit for fermenting these beers, given the distinct characteristics they have. But they're very clean lactic sourness without all those earth components. Once they learn how to kettle sour these, in other words, lactobacillus is a bacteria that might operate a little bit on the faster side. You can actually ferment these beers in a couple of days, maybe a week. Once you get that desired level of acidity, either by reading it on a pH meter or by tasting it, making sure you get the flavors of the acids you want in the mash, they basically drain off the liquid and go to boil that way. That locks in the sourness, that locks in the sugar, so later you can continue to ferment these beers with traditional yeast and build the alcohol at touch and continue to dry the beer out without contributing any more sourness than what the mash has already locked in. Traditionally, some of these beers like the Berliner Weiss, by the way, ferments a lot the same way, much more wheat driven, and you're not going to stop the fermentation process with the Berliner Weiss. What you're going to do is you're going to let the Berliner Weiss go completely to the end of fermentation. Bacteria does not operate like yeast. Yeast is always going to leave some portion of sweetness behind in case it wakes up from its very long slumber and it needs something to kickstart its life again. Bacteria is like the honey badgers of the microorganism industries. They don't care. They will eat all the sugars and almost create 100% dryness if you let them go far enough, long enough, and they will peter out and they will actually die. So Berliner Weiss will actually go to a larger sour degree than Goses, but your Berliner Weiss is not going to be quite as alcoholic as their Goses because you don't stop the fermentation with sugars locked in and you don't continue to ferment it with the yeast later. But both these beers are very traditional to the northern regions. Like I said, Leipzig, Germany for the Goses, the Goslar River, Goslar region, and then for the Berliner Weiss, obviously in mainstream Berlin. Some of these sours were really a little bit on the too acidic side, even for common beer drinkers in those regions, even when they were popular. So they would always, or it'd be very common for them to actually add fruit juices or add some sort of fruits to that, and they call that the Mitschuss characteristic, particularly in the Berliner Weiss. So I think a lot of the modern brewers have taken that notion. It's like, hey, we want fruit with the sourness. Today's beer drinkers actually do want the sourness. They want that full sourness. They don't want to balance it out with any kind of fruit sweeteners. But we do want those fruit flavors. So it's very common to see the fruit flavors really build in to the Berliner Weiss. And whenever it comes to the Florida Weiss, you're using things like guava, passion fruit, cranberry to create this almost a Bellini, a sangria, a little bit more of a cocktail-driven flavor, but with the sourness that you really want out of those cleaner, sharper sour ales. Alvin, they kind of took that Belgian thing a little bit further. It's very common to see other breweries like Jolly Pumpkin and some others try the spontaneous fermentation methods to make their beers sour ales. Alvin does some of that same trick themselves. And even though you don't get that same characteristic that you get from Brussels because you're in a different area and it has different microorganisms in the air, you can end up with different characteristics. A little bit more pedio heavy on this one. Pediococcus is a very strong bacteria. You got to be very careful with the strains of Pediococcus and the treatment because they can get away from you in a hurry and create very unpleasant flavors. But Alvin's doesn't do that. They have this really spicy, much sharper characteristic. This version of the Phi actually boosts the alcohol to 10%. Most of the time, the alcohol ranges on these are going to hover somewhere around 3.5% to 5.5% on most of your sour ales. So to see something at 10% is quite challenging and not very common at all. What you can get out of the more alcoholic sour ales, if the fermentation is not handled correctly, you can end up with flavors that resemble nail polish remover, super glue, acetone, linoleum, vinyl. Those kind of characteristics can come through kind of on the stronger side and be very off-putting. Sometimes if the PDO character can get a little bit on the stronger side, you can end up with smoky aromas. You can end up with texture flavors that increase a lot of viscosity. They nickname it elephant snot. No one needs elephant snot in the beer. So you got to be really careful if you're a brewer what organisms you're actually treating and how you're treating your fermentation temperatures, vessel size, vessel shapes, all that stuff matters. Some other noteworthy kind of sours that are out there. Wild ales, the Americans are trying a lot of things when it comes to wild ales. They can become a little bit more on the earthy, maybe not as sour side. Cricket's Dave does a really nice job. We've crossed those beers before. So You do end up with the kettle sours. That's very popular. That's the reason why most of your brew pubs can now make a very distinctive sour beer, very clean, very refreshing, very summery, and not have to charge you a lot for them. So we really do thank Anderson Valley a lot for modernizing these sour flavors, make these sour characteristics available for everyday consumption, for refreshment, for redeeming values whenever it comes to palate cleansing and all those. So, sour ales, they really do span the gamut. Whenever we get deeper into spring, when we get deeper into summer, we will dissect these a little bit more. That's kind of a 101 whenever it comes to sour ales, but we're gonna get much deeper in each one of these styles as the summer rolls along. Before I let you go, let's cross some other paths here. The bitterness in these beers is usually going to be very low. You're not going to have a lot of bitterness in these beers. They want the acidity to carry the balance, not the bitterness. So if you don't like bitter beer, this is maybe safe haven for you. The color of these beers are usually going to be as pale straw to pale gold characteristic. Rarely do you get in those amber territories. They're usually very sparkling, very clean. You put them in a flute, something tall, something very champagne-like. The original Brussels beer were the Gozes. They were nicknamed the Burgundy of Brussels, or I'm sorry, the Champagne of Brussels, because they had a very champagne-like characteristic. Those big bubbles, they stream very strongly. So you put them in a flute, and you really take advantage of all the kind of the aromas and celebration that flute gives you. Temperature of these beers, most people like to drink them a little on the warmer side. In Belgium, I've seen these old men just sit on these patios and just drink, glass after glass of these sour ales and just sweat like crazy in the 90-degree temperature. However, I like to drink them a little bit on the cooler side. I would say between 45 to 50 degrees might be kind of a nice spot. I might even go 40 if it's really hot outside and not just finish them on the lawn. I'm going to get a sour ale like a Goza, like Anderson Valley, and take it to the shower with me. I might get a little on the cooler side just for its redeeming refreshment properties. When you get a beer colder, you give up on its flavor because it has a tendency to numb the taste buds a little bit. But what you gain is refreshment. So there's always a trade-off between how refreshing do you want the texture and the temperature to be versus how much flavor do you want the beer to give you. Can you cellar these beers? The Belgian ones, yes. They age very, very well. They go very well into decades. They're one of the few beer examples that actually can go decades into aging and actually improve. Your kettle sours or your Gozes, your Berliner Weiss, no. Those are usually so simplistic that they're better fresh. They're crisper, they're cleaner, they do oxidize a little bit over time. So I'd say the more modern sour ales, don't cellar those, but your more historic ones, yes, you can. Your Jolly Pumpkins, your Cricket Staves, some of those guys, they do a little bit more of the traditional Belgian thing, so those will age well even though they are considered modern. So there's a little bit of play in what you consider aging and don't aging. If it's largely lactobacillus and just one organism that does the heavy lifting, then don't age that one. The other ones have more complex array of microorganisms, bacterias and wild yeast, then those have a tendency to actually hold up much better during the aging process. Food pairings, whenever it comes to cheeses, with beers like these, I like to go with something kind of softer, kind of flakier, a little bit more of a flakier, younger goat cheese. Maybe a brie might do okay, but fetas, anything that kind of resembles those kind of soft cheeses, I think would work real well in complement. Entrees, sour ales and mussels are a very classic pairing, so feel free to steam some mussels in a beer and then pair the mussels with the same type of beer. That usually goes off real well. It really brings out those briny flavors and brightness of, to contrast the earth of the mussels, does real well. Desserts, if you really want to play that balancing game, you can go with like a flan or a standard cheesecake, something that doesn't give you a whole lot a polarizing flavor. You really get a soothing characteristic with the cream as a contrast to the acidity nature of the beer. But this is one of the few examples where I could actually double down and see a key lime pie working, or some sort of sherbet working real well. Sour ales, where you link up a sour with a sour, even though they come head to head really, really strongly. I think the palate cleansing nature of the sour beers can handle the acidity of some of those desserts a little bit better too. So that's going to wrap up today's beer school. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you have any requests of what you want to see me cover in beer schools down the road, please let me know, and we'll try to hit those as best we can. Thank you again. We appreciate your help.